Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the city, around the state. Coming to you live from the heart of Chicago, it is e-learning with Mr. Moeller. So today we're going to be looking a little bit at federalism in American government, trying to kind of give a little bit more context for the reading that you guys are doing. So first of all, this week's takeaway. So federalism reflects the dynamic, that means changing, distribution of power between national and state governments. And so we look at these for the enumerated, reserved, and concurrent powers. So we're going to take a little bit more look at that today. So power sharing in general, it's a really easy thing to say, right? Like, oh, we're going to share power, but it's really complex, right? Who gets to do what? What happens if there's overlap? If you share power with your siblings or with friends, you kind of know this, right? So there's a lot of people that are going to be influencing decisions. Even just thinking about decisions about your education, right? All these different groups. And so you have to have some sort of a system in place to allow all these different groups to work together. And that is the system of federalism in the United States. So in theory here, we're talking about cooperation between central and state governments. And so best place to start, so looking at the rules of the game. So in the Constitution, the relationship between the states and federal government is spelled out pretty basically. Article 1 has the enumerated powers of Congress to raise an army, right, tax, make trade laws, and those are the powers that the federal government gets. 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights says that all powers not given to the federal government go to the states. Things like education, gambling, driver's licenses. These are all state-run things. And actually, Nevada was the first major state to allow legalized gaming. Then, if there's a conflict between the two, Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, says that in a conflict between a state and a federal government, the federal government is going to always win. And so that's the rules of the game. But again, they're complicated. So a good way to think about Supremacy Clause is to think about it as a ladder. And the higher you go, the more those laws are going to carry weight. You have local laws like Chicago or Cook County laws. You have Illinois laws. And then you jump up into federal laws, all the way up to the U.S. Constitution. And so if at any point any of those laws on the lower rung conflict with a law on the kind of higher rung, the higher rung is always going to win. And that's happened many times in U.S. history, and I imagine it'll continue to today. Also, too, I always get the question about Dillons Rule. Oh, man, everyone always asks about that. So the Constitution allows the states to make their own government. We call these local governments, county governments, city governments, but the way that our government is structured, the way the Constitution is structured, local governments can only get their power from the states. So the states are recognized in the U.S. Constitution, and then each state has the right, if they want to empower local governments. So in theory, tomorrow, Illinois could just say to Chicago, you're no longer a city. You don't get a mayor, you don't have aldermen, you don't have your own government, the state just runs it. And so all local laws and all local governments, they get their power directly from the state. So even though Chicago is big and powerful, the state of Illinois could actually get rid of us just like that, according to Dillons Rule. So I just want to roll through a couple things that I'm sure we're going to have questions about in the textbook. And the first thing is that these rules are very vague, right? The Commerce Clause regulates business activity that is interstate or foreign, but it does not actually say what the definition of commerce is or what interstate means, and so that's a problem. The second big problem is the necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper to carry out, the powers that were already there. And so what is necessary, what is proper to carry out those powers in Article 1? If, for instance, you want to have an army, that's your power, well, is it necessary and proper to draft people, to force people? And the other controversy of this is if the federal government can keep implying powers, then will the states not have any left, right? Will the reserve powers never actually come into play if the government just keeps implying powers? So this is a big piece of our fight, is how just simply vague the rules are. And so we're just going to kind of go through a couple of cases that kind of define a little bit more about kind of, I guess, the guardrails of federalism. The first one's a real famous one. You guys should remember this one from last year. Mccall of Maryland. This is the national bank. Oh, Lord, right? So if the U.S. government is going to, make money and spend money and borrow money and pay things, Well, then the people at the time, Mccall v. Maryland in the 1800s, they argued that it was necessary and proper to have a bank to carry out the powers of Article 1 in terms of money. And so their argument was, well, the bank is not a reserve power. Every state has a bank, but it doesn't mean it just belongs to them. And so the showdown here was between the 10th Amendment, reserve powers, and the implied powers under necessary and proper. And then the secondary piece of this was the supremacy clause. Could the state of Maryland actually interfere with the running of the federal national bank? And the answer is very simply no. In Mccall v. Maryland, the federal government basically won out that implied powers were a thing, and you could imply powers based on Article 1. And second, that the federal government is always supreme, and that no state can go up against the federal government. Then we have a case that deals a little bit more with commerce, a little bit more with business. And the issue in Gibbs v. Ogden was state versus federal business licenses to operate steamboats in the Hudson River. Well, the Hudson River, if you guys know anything about geography, it's in more than one state. And so this brought up the idea of Commerce Clause. Is this, river, traveling this river, is it intrastate or interstate? And so who would have power? The state of New York or the federal government? And so the meaning of commerce was actually greatly expanded by this, in which the Supreme Court said, okay, commerce is trade, right? I give you $5 and you give me a cheeseburger. But it's also more. It's avenues of business. It's the rivers and roads, the railroads, eventually air travel that is going to go across state lines. And furthermore, since, these steamboats would start in New York, go down through New Jersey, the idea was, well, even though the boat was maybe intrastate, it would eventually cross state lines. And so that became today that any product that will eventually be sold across state lines can be regulated by the federal government. A really great example of this are your toilets in your cars. Federal government regulates cars because they're produced in one state and then sold across the country. They regulate toilets because of the same reason. And so what the federal government's doing kind of early on is that it's really expanding the power that it's able to have. Then during the Great Depression in the 1930s, one of the most important Commerce Clause cases came up, Wickard v. Filburn. And this one asked a real interesting question. Can your action be regulated by the government just because it might have an effect on commerce, an effect on the economy? It's an interesting question. And so farmer Roscoe Filburn, he decided that he was going to grow more wheat than he was allowed to grow. If you guys remember the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, they were saying people could only grow a certain amount because you need a certain supply in order to regulate prices. Well, Roscoe Filburn decided, well, I don't want to buy wheat. I have all this farmland. I'm just going to grow some and feed it to my animals. But the government didn't like that because the government said that Roscoe Filburn, by not buying wheat for the animals, by just consuming his own supply, he was actually affecting the market. And that if every farmer in America did what Roscoe Filburn did, that it would have a substantial effect on the market for animal feed. And so they basically said that any action that has a substantial effect on commerce can be regulated by the federal government. And so this is a very big increase in power for the federal government. They're stretching commerce to mean almost anything that can even affect business activity. It's the basis for laws governing our light bulbs, guns in school zones, again, low-flow toilets. And so it's a huge, huge deal. And so here's the Wickard standard just to kind of think of a little bit easier. If an activity, even if it's in a state, was done everywhere or widespread, would it have a substantial effect? And so one great example of this is efficiency standards. Your light bulbs have to, according to federal law, have a certain efficiency. Because the idea is that if people, use these products, widespread, they could have a substantial effect. And what this does is it really blurs that line between inter and intrastate. So it's a lot harder now to argue, well, I'm just in Illinois, so the federal government doesn't apply to me. After Wickard v. Filburn, that line is almost non-existent. And so even in just the last 20, 30 years, we've had questions of, can the federal government regulate guns in school zones? Can the federal government require you to purchase insurance through Obamacare? Can the federal government prosecute marijuana home growers in states where it's legal? And so these are all just very fascinating questions that federalism has brought up and will continue to bring up. So just kind of jumping off of Wickard is USV Lopez. So this one's big. This one actually limits, or at least tries to limit, the power of the federal government. USV Lopez, it's kind of a fun case. It's a little bit weird. So Lopez was a student who he brought a gun to school because a friend asked him to hold it onto him. He had made a purchase, and so he was just going to be like the bag man, and he got caught with this gun. So he's guilty, absolutely, nothing wrong with his trial, anything else. But what happened that was very key is that he was charged by the federal government, not the state of Texas. And so Lopez's lawyer argued that the Gun-Free School Zones Act, a law passed by the federal government in D.C., was actually unconstitutional because there was no connection between guns in school zones and commerce. And so, if there's no link, well, the federal government would have no right to ban it. Whoa. And so, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Lopez. Kid brought a gun to school, and he got away with it because the law was unconstitutional. Because the Supreme Court said, without a clear connection to a substantial effect on commerce, the federal officers did not have the right to prosecute Lopez. And their ruling said that the general policing power belongs to the states and not the federal government. And so, really this question was, are there any limits to federal power? And so we consult, our cases. Mccall of Maryland would say, is this linked to any enumerated powers? And it's very, very hard to say that it is, at least for the court. You then look and say, hey, is this interstate? Well, it wasn't. It all happened in the state of Texas. But then you can ask Wickard v. Filburn, would gun possession in schools have a substantial effect on interstate commerce? And now, all of a sudden, you have a real debate. And so this is really federalism in action. The Supreme Court eventually will say that Texas could have arrested and prosecuted Lopez, but the U.S. government could not, because it was not interstate, it was not commerce, and they argue that it had no substantial effect on commerce. But a lot of people disagree. So whenever we read Supreme Court cases, there's always two sides, a majority and a minority. And they both argue kind of why they think they're right. Majority is obviously you have to have 5 or more to get a majority. And so the majority in this case actually ruled in favor of Lopez, saying that implied powers had just simply gone too far. That police power does not have connection to commerce, and that Congress should really have to show a real economic connection if they're going to make these laws. But on the other hand, people who disagree with them said very clearly, well, guns and violence in a neighborhood or a school zone has a big effect on commerce, on your education, your earning power, investment, your insurance, and therefore the economy. So as you can see, none of these cases are going to be cut and dry. They're all going to be really complicated because we're dealing with a lot of different factors. So historically, we've had other debates about federalism that we can probably remember from last year. One was nullification. Could a state actually refuse to follow federal law or pay a tax? And we saw that play out in the Alien and Sedition Act, the tariff of abominations that almost led to the American Civil War. The American Civil War kind of settled the nullification debate, but that idea is out there. What powers does a state have to resist the federal government? In Dred Scott v. Sanford, there was also this idea of, like, as new issues come up, are they state or federal? In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the question was slavery a federal or state issue came up. The Supreme Court at the time said that the states, they got to decide for themselves. Well, those fights over slavery, because the Supreme Court said they couldn't be settled at a federal level, ended up kind of just snowballing into the Civil War. And it actually took constitutional amendments, right, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, to actually overturn this case. Because in this case, the Supreme Court said Dred Scott, who was a black man, a former slave, was not a citizen. He was not a citizen, had no right to sue in a court. And so as we can see, sometimes cases, they require follow-up. They require something to change in the system in order for, what we would call justice to happen. Which brings us to just kind of some textbook stuff. Federalism. Layer cake versus marble cake, dual versus cooperative. The real thing here to just think about is that it's very basic. Cooperative federalism is this idea that we're working together. Dual federalism says everyone stays in their lane. And so for most of U.S. history, dual federalism was the norm. Constitutional amendments, along the way were passed to enhance national power, but really in emergency situations. Income taxes came up in order to be able to pay for wars. The 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. America had changed. There was a lot more people who weren't property owners. There was a lot more kind of like democracy that was wanted. And so over time, we've kind of gradually changed things. But the idea was to keep the federal and the state governments very separate. But that all changes in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was an unbelievable challenge, and it required, along with World War II and then the Cold War, every government to really kind of be working together. And so cooperative federalism, or marble cake, is nation-centered. It's what do we do as Americans to solve this problem, not what are we doing in Illinois to solve the problem. Usually this comes up because of things like war, depression. In this case, we're seeing some of kind of the limit to this with coronavirus. And so if you're into cooperative federalism, the idea of this is if you're the federal government, you give states money called categorical grants. And you give this money to the states and you say, this is how you're going to spend it. We're all spending it in the same way. And so if you want this money, you have to do, what we said. A really great example of that are highways. The federal government pays for highways. They help build them and maintain them. But they also require that if you take federal government money, your drinking age must be 21 in order to cut down on the incidences of DUIs and everything that comes along with that. And so if you're someone that wants the federal government to have control over the money, you like categorical grants. In cooperative federalism, the federal government also does things called mandates, which are big. Mandates are when you they're federal laws that tell the states what to do. They say you have to do this thing, but they often do not give them the money to do that. So they're usually called unfunded mandates. A great example of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The federal government says every state, every business open to the public has to have some reasonable accommodations. Well, there's no money for that. If I want to make the Thompson Center more accessible to people with disabilities, I have to find the money as a state in order to do it. And so unfunded mandates are sometimes very controversial, but they're often ways to kind of extend protections from the federal government to kind of all the states. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, really, really great example of that type of a thing. Supreme Court also has a really big part to play in this. Starting in kind of the 1930s, you start to see civil rights actually emerge as a thing. No longer are you going to have the Supreme Court kind of ruling in favor kind of discrimination. The 14th Amendment is going to start to be used, and all of your rights are going to become incorporated. Oh man, that's a definition you're going to need. Incorporation is when the federal government makes the states follow parts of the Bill of Rights. And so that's going to be big. A case like Gideon v. Wainwright that said that every state has to give you an attorney no matter what. That's what incorporation is all about. Wickard v. Filbert expanded commerce powers. The federal government began to kind of change a lot of things. And so what you saw up to the 1980s was really just an expansion of federal government power. National government power. You see that change a little bit in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan ran for for the presidency, and one of his famous lines was, "Government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem." And so because of that, if government is the problem, then you want less federal government doing stuff, and you want the states handling things more on their own. We call this devolution. So instead of power going up to the federal, it's trickling now down to the states. And so if you don't believe that a powerful government is the best way to handle things, which conservatives usually do not, you want to give states block grants. Money, chunks of money with no strings attached that the local government decides how to spend. So a block grant could be, $1 million for education for the state of Illinois. It's up to Illinois to decide how it wants to spend that money. And so local control is a really, really big, big value of kind of conservatives. And so Ronald Reagan, coming in as a conservative president, tried to restore a lot of power to local governments as opposed to the national government of kind of an FDR, an LBJ, and then I would kind of put Barack Obama then in that category in the 2000s. This also came with it a lot of reform. Entitlement reform, things like Medicare, Medicaid, Link, SNAP food stamps, aid to family with dependent children, great example of devolution. Republicans criticized that it was encouraging too many people to not work, rely on the federal government, and so working with Bill Clinton, they actually passed a lot of reforms that allowed states to decide how to run their entitlement programs. So it took control away from the federal government, gave it back to the states. Now you can argue that's good, it's bad, it's ugly. There's a lot of disagreement on the best way to run government. Then, in the same era, you had USV Lopez, kind of limiting government's power. You had the 10th Amendment, 11th Amendment. A lot of states really started to reassert themselves a way that they hadn't before kind of the Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton era. And so in today's modern era, I would say the federal government had a pretty big resurgence during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama years. 9/11, the wars that we fought, Hurricane Katrina, storms that we fight, our current recession that we're in, 2008 financial crisis, really big problems often make us look for really big solutions. Something like the Patriot Act to fight terrorism or Obamacare to fix the insurance system. And so what we're seeing today is a big debate over the powers of the federal government. And these debates, much like they always have been, center around certain things. They center around welfare programs and who should control those. They center around education and how education should be funded and who should control it. As states legalize narcotics, we have debates over that. And as we debate policing, the FBI, local and state police, these are all debates that have their roots in this idea of federalism. Which government should and which government has the best ability to handle a problem. And so one of the biggest fights that we also have is the federal government too big? And so we're going to keep looking at that through the debate with the feds and anti-feds, as well as our modern American politics. So folks, have a great day, and we'll see you soon.